Today, I'm going to show you how to do a resin pour. They're not nearly as scary as they might seem if you've never done them before, but it's always good to start out small. And for the start of the show, I'm thinking we can have a... Hey, an Orca! Perfect! Only it'll be extra small, and of course we'll have to add lights. I'm Sayer, and this is Witch Cove Crafts. Let's start with a tiny whale. I've got this little random bag of sea creatures with our Orca star in it. I'm sure the others will come in handy at some point, so we'll hang on to those. For the diorama, I'm going to repurpose this dice container. If you've ever been to a hobby store that sells D&D dice sets, these are the containers the cheapest dice tend to come in. I think we'll need a character, something to give us a little bit of a story. For the size of the Orca, one of these N-scale diorama figures should be about perfect. Let's give our little guy a boat. I could probably find an N-scale boat online to print or buy, but I can also scratch build one with plasticard. I'll use my figure I picked to measure out a rough size for the floor of the boat. Then I can cut it out with a hobby knife. When cutting styrene, remember that it's often easiest just to score the sheet, then bend it to snap it off cleanly. And it sands super easily, so don't worry too much if your cuts aren't perfect. You can easily clean them up later. And after I sand the shape of the boat, then I check again with the figure to make sure it feels right. Now, of course we're going to put lights in this. In this case, a button cell should be plenty, and battery cases are available for very cheap online. Next, I'm gonna figure out the terrain before I build the rest of the boat, with our friendly neighborhood XPS foam. A hot wire knife is enough to quickly cut it down to the shape of the plastic base. And then we can add more detail with a knife and our fingers. With the diorama scale solved, now it's time to really dive into the boat. To start that off, I'll add a ridge of plastic along the bottom to outline the shape, and then I'll trim the nose down to give the front a curve. Next, I'll score and snap out a long strip of thin plastic to form into a wall. A thin layer of Insta-Cure super glue is enough to tack the body in place, and then I can begin wrapping the strip around the boat one side at a time. After trimming off the excess, I can check the size against the diorama again. Then I add some small vertical strips to act as the ribs of the boat. Throughout this whole process, CA Accelerator is invaluable. It pretty much instantly cures superglue and locks it in place. Now I can take even thinner strips and lay them lengthwise across the supports to build up the shell. Throughout this whole process, I'm oversizing my pieces just a bit and then clipping and sanding them into the right size after they're already in place. With the body of the boat done, it's time for the sealing layer. Mod Podge to seal the foam and protect it from the spray primer, plaster for texture, and water to thin. And after a quick mix, I can smear it on the base and dab it around with a brush. Once the initial sealing layer is done, I add more plaster to thicken the mix, and dab on some extra texture and fill in the gaps. Finally, while the plaster is still wet, I add some train ballast for a fine sand layer and use an old brush to refine it. Now back to the boat. I decided to add some texture to the wood panels using a scriber. This tool is often used for models like planes and Gundams to refine details and add deeper panel lines. Here, it makes for a great way to add textured wood grain. At this point, I can also use a hobby knife to trim off the flashing, which is the excess plastic from the molding process on the figure while it's a little soft. And then I can tack it in place to the front of the boat. For the light, I can drill a small hole in the back of the boat using a pin vise and a jeweler's bit. A tiny LED will work well enough as a lantern by itself, and I can tack the wires down along the arm and back of the figure with glue. To hide the wires inside the boat, I add a little bench with some more plasticard and run the wire beneath it. And to finish the boat off, I add some trim. A strip on the back, and a cut rim for the rest, with a keel from thicker plastic. With all that done, I connect the wires temporarily to check the LED. I also want to accentuate the whale in the final piece, but I want it to feel kind of mystical. Tiny ultraviolet LEDs under the boat should do the trick here, except they have a higher voltage requirement than the white ones, which is too high for a single battery to power. So I'll switch the battery pack out for a double pack. Every battery you have in sequence in a circuit increases the total voltage of the circuit. A little gel superglue and some accelerator is enough to tack the lights on the bottom of the boat where the whale will be. Then I can route all the wires through a hole in the terrain and lock it in place with glue. And then use more superglue to seal off the hole. With all the wiring in place, I can trim and strip them down for later. And finally, we can stick the star of the show in place with a little more glue on the fin to make it look like it's floating. The boat's going to need a little more detail, so I'll add an outboard motor by folding and gluing a strip a couple of times to make a little plastic block. Then I can cut and sand it into the right shape and glue it on. A piece of styrene rod makes the handle, and a sheet trimmed to shape makes the rudder. A disc trimmed from a styrene tube is enough to suggest a propeller at this size. Finally, I can tack a little bit of styrene on each side of the light to help build the lantern and shape the light direction a little bit. And as a last touch, I can add in some larger rocks with pieces of cork. Finally, I can clean up the sides of the base and mask out the LEDs with some liquid mask from Vallejo. This stuff is great for tiny lights as it covers the lights during painting and then can be peeled right off afterwards. And now it's time to paint, starting with a primer layer in Zenithal Highlight. Hey look, I didn't delete the footage this time. First, I'll build up some washes of pinks and greens to add life to the rocks. Note that as I go deeper, I use less pink as red light travels less as you go deeper in the water. Then I wash the whole thing over with blues and grays, changing the blues out for browns gradually as I move towards the surface. This will combine with the tinted resin to help it look more like 30 feet of ocean water and less like an inch of resin. Brighter, lighter blues on top help sell the light source from above. Then I can paint the details on our little orca friend much more accurately than the original toy. A wash of browns, shifting to blue-grays underneath the waterline, brings out the detail on the boat. Then we can give our little fisherman a rain jacket and hat. Finally, we can start to paint in some rippling caustics to really make the base pop. I actually tried to over-exaggerate them a bit, knowing that the resin will do the effect some, but honestly I'm not even sure I took it far enough. Now it's time for the fun part, prepping the resin pour. A sheet of acrylic will build a mold, so let's mark out the pieces we'll need. Then we can use a cutoff wheel on the Dremel to score and snap the acrylic. This acrylic was honestly a little thicker than what was really needed for this mold, and it would have also been easier to cut on a bandsaw, but I don't have a bandsaw, and the acrylic was super cheap from the thrift store. With our pieces cut, it's time to fix them in place using silicone caulk. Be sure to wear gloves. The layer on the base holds it in place, and then I can go back afterwards for each side to seal off the joints between each piece with another bead of silicone. Note that when doing a small box like this, it's a lot easier to do one side at a time. Let the silicone set before adding the next piece. I'm telling you this because I didn't do it, and I wound up with silicone smeared on the inside of my mold. Once the silicone is cured, it's time to pour the resin. For this, I'll use a 2-part slow-curing deep pour epoxy resin. This gives it the longest possible cure time, which is great since I don't have a vacuum chamber. Normally you can use a vacuum to pull bubbles out of the resin, but in the absence of one, a very slow cure time will give the bubbles time to gather and rise to the top of the pour, at which point they can be popped with a blowtorch. Alcohol inks will let me tint the resin. I want to make sure to over-tint slightly, since I'll just add it to 1/2 of the epoxy mixture. Once I like the color, I add the second part of the mixture, mix thoroughly, and then pour carefully into the mold, avoiding the boat. Once the resin has had 48 hours to cure, I can peel, or break, I guess, in this case, the mold off. Then I can use clippers and a craft knife to clean up the flashing on the resin. Now let's add some water effects. First, we can add splashes by drawing out some splash shapes on a wall of the mold with UV resin and a toothpick. After curing them, they can be peeled off and chopped up, then set in place on the diorama with more UV resin. We'll add some to the tail and the rocks, and then bulk them up with a bit more resin. Once that's done, I can add waves and ripples with water effects from Woodlet and Scenics. It's basically just acrylic gloss medium, so if that's all you have, that'll work too. It goes on white, but it dries clear. Once the gel dries, I can add white foam to the waves and splashes with acrylic. Now it's time for the lights. This time, I'll use a breadboard to mock up my layout before soldering it all together. Since I'm going to use a 6-volt power supply, with two 3-volt batteries stacked together, I'll need to add a resistor along with my usual potentiometers so I don't burn out the white LED. The potentiometers will then let me adjust the brightness of my elements after everything's put together. And now the last step. I'll need to bulk up the base to make room for the new power supply. For that, I'll use another dice container base and cut out walls of thin styrene that I can cut to match the curves of the terrain. After gluing, it can be trimmed and sanded down to the perfect shape. And finally, I can prime it all and then coat it with a layer of Musso black for that perfect museum look. And with that, it's ready. Resin really is magical. We've taken a little rubber Orca toy and a few materials and transformed it into our own little slice of ocean. I've added a list of materials if you want to try your own take on this in the description, and now I've got Amazon affiliate links, so you can support the channel just by buying your own materials. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Also, my daughter directed the intro and wants you to know she had a very strong artistic vision for it.
Let's just do one without the Orca. Just give me the Orca, I'm gonna hug it. No!